cultural genocide, targeting the ethno-religious minority groups like the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, Southern Mongolians, the Kyrgyz, and others. Buddhist statues are bulldozed, monasteries are gutted, mosques are destroyed, children are forcibly separated from their families and packed off to colonial boarding schools where religion and native languages are often forbidden. But even under intense persecution, and I'll end with this, faith persists throughout China, and the number of the faithful grows. In my work in Congress, I've heard unthinkable stories of religious persecution, but I've also listened to accounts of underground churches, brave clergy, and steadfast believers, every bit as courageous as saints of the early church. We'll hear some of those inspiring and harrowing stories here today. In an interview with The Guardian, the pastor of one Chinese church stated, "In this war, in Xinjiang, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Chengdu, the rulers have chosen an enemy that can never be imprisoned, the soul of man." The pastor ended with an assessment that we must make come true, which is that the PRC rulers are doomed to lose. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Pastor Pan for his remarks. You honor us with your presence, and from there we'll go around the table for brief remarks and then a robust discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. 这个非常感谢布莱克主席和各位议员朋友们给我机会做见证。
So Honorable Chairman Gallagher of the committee and members and friends, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
感谢上帝的眷顾，我也代表我们五月花教会感谢美国政府批准我们所有的家庭来到自由的美国。也感谢各位朋友议员们为我们呼吁，为我们努力。
We thank God for His favor, and on behalf of our church, I also want to thank U.S. government for granting the approval, the arrival of all Mayflower members to the Free America. Also want to thank many friends and legislators for their prayerful appeals and efforts on our behalf.
中国共产党是坚定的无神论，他反对一切的宗教自由。在中国共产党的统治底下，中国其实是没有信仰自由。
The CCP is staunchly atheistic and against all religious beliefs. There is no freedom of religion in China under the rule of the CCP.
在中国，成为一个真正的基督徒是需要付出代价的。作为牧师，我特别清楚这一点。
There is a real price to pay for being a true Christian in China, and as pastor, I'm especially aware of this.
教会经常会受到被迫停止敬拜、被迫迁移、被迫这个关闭，或者是教会的奉献被没收。
Churches are often forced to stop services. They are relocated, banned, and closed. And even the church offerings were not allowed collected.
牧师会被国家安全局的警察不定时的威胁，被迫迁移，被限制出境，被罚款。不过通常他不会以一个宗教信仰的罪名，而是别的罪名，这么无期的进行定罪。
So national security agents threaten the pastors at irregular intervals and force them to relocate, restrict them from leaving the country and fine them, etc. However, the authorities usually do not enforce charges of religious belief. Instead, Christians are shamelessly punished with other charges.
我在深圳，中国最年轻的这座最自由有活力的这个城市里面，我在这里做牧师14年。
I have been a pastor in Shenzhen City, one of the really youngest industrialized city, Guangdong Province, for 14 years.
以上的这些威胁不断的在我身上发生，因此在其他的城市其实是更多。
And all of the above threats had happened to me constantly.
对我的迫害有一个很重要的原因是我接受了美国改革宗长老会的神学训练，也被这个宗派安立为牧师。这个在中国共产党的眼中，他会看为我在勾结海外的反华势力。
one of the more important reasons for my persecution is that because I received theological training from the Reformed Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, was ordained as a PCE pastor by that denomination. That this falls under the charge of so-called colluding with anti-Chinese forces overseas in the eyes of the CCP.
一直负责监督威胁我的一个国家安全局的警察，姓黄的警察，他多次威胁我说，他随时可以抓我。
So that police officer responsible for me, from the National Security Agency, he basically supervising all the threats against me. He repeatedly threatened me that he can arrest me and put me in jail anytime.
Yeah. 在2019年的10月份，我和五月花教会的群体，我们离开了中国之后，我们来到了去到韩国济州，去到泰国，我们也受到中国不同程度的迫害威胁。
After I left China with our Mayflower Church Community in October 2019, we were threatened and intimidated to varying degrees from South Korea and then for several weeks even in Thailand. While in Jeju Island in South Korea, most of us even received threatening phone calls and from the Chinese government, from different other branches.
在韩国济州的时候，我们受到领事馆，中国领事馆给我们打电话，要求我们回国接受惩罚。
Even the Chinese consulate in Jeju Island in South Korea called us and demanded us to return to China to be punished for our sins.
在泰国的时候，我们受到间谍的跟踪威胁，我们多次的被迫从不同的地方再搬迁搬移躲走。
While in Thailand, we were even followed and by spies of the CCP and threatened to relocate several times. Several times.
最后我们被泰国政府逮捕了，说我们非法签证过期了，然后要把我们遣送回中国。幸好得到美国政府及时的帮助，把我们救出来。
Then we were finally arrested by even the Thailand government. We were nearly deported back to China. Thankfully, the U.S. government has
在
helped
中
us.
国离开中国之后3年半，其实我们在国内的家人、亲人、朋友不断的受到威胁和恐吓。
So our family members, relatives back to China during this 3.5 years exile time has been constantly being interrogated and arrested and threatened.
我们知道这个中共的政法委成立了一个五月花专案组，去到各省不同的地方威胁我们的亲人。
There was a special even the investigative committee was a task force was set up even by the CCP's political and legal committee.
有威胁我们的亲人说让他失去工作，或者是让他失去养老金。
So our family members were threatened to make them lose their jobs or even make lose their pensions and so on.
就是在今年的2月14号的那一天，有4名专案组的警察去到湖南湘潭，找到我妻子的母亲，在她的家里面抢她的手机，恐吓她，让她要求我们回国，导致她当时就冠心病发。
So on February 14th this year, 4 this CCP task force officers went to my wife's mother's home in Xiangtan, Hunan province, and robbed her of her cell phone. They threatened her and demanded that we return to China, and causing her to have a coronary heart attack.
所以我特别请求委员会和美国社会要关注中国日恶化的这个宗教迫害的这种情况。
So I ask this committee and the U.S. Congress to pay attention to the worsening situation of religious persecution in China.
特别是在中国实施了国家安全法和反间谍法之后， 他对宗教的迫害，经常是以危及国家安全的这个罪名进行了。
Especially after the implementation of China's national security law and anti-espionage law, religious persecution is often carried out under the guise of crimes against the national security.
请特别关注以下的这些纯粹因为实践宗教信仰而被判刑的，或者说面临判刑的这些基督徒和教会的领袖。
Please really pay special attention to those church leaders, Christians, who has been sentenced to or are facing heavy imprisonment purely for practicing their Christian faith.
王一牧师被判刑9年，曹山强牧师判刑7年，穆恩全道被判刑3年半，王以诺被判刑3年，傅全娟姐妹被判刑6年，邓天勇传道被判刑3年，冯群浩弟兄判刑2年6个月，还有韩丽姐妹、教维凯弟兄、李杰传道、韩晓东传道、王强弟兄、王英杰、王英夫妇、王淑芳姐妹、邓彦祥传道、朱龙江弟兄、王伟才弟兄、朱小玲姐妹、王小玲牧师，还有在山势焚林这个金灯台教会的王小光牧师和在教会里面被捕的这12个传道人。
Pastor Wang Yi for 9 years, Pastor Zhang Cao Sanchang for 7 years, Pastor Wen Chuan for 3.5 years, Enoch Wang for 3 years, Sister Fu Xuanjuan for 6 years, Pastor Dong Tianying for 3 years, and Brother Feng Chuan Hao for 2 years and 6 months, Sister Han Li, Brother Zhao Weike, Preacher Li Jie, Preacher Han Xiaodong, Brother Wang Qiang, Pastor Wang Yingjie and his wife Wang Ying, Sister Wang Shufang, Preacher Dong Yanxiang, Brother Zhu Liangjiang, Brother Wang Weihai, Sister Zhu Chaoling, Pastor Huang Xiaoling, and Pastor Wang Xiaoguang of Golden Lampstand Church. That church, that's the church was bombed. In Shanxi province, 12 of their leaders are also arrested, facing harsh trial.
我知道在费城有一口大钟叫自由钟，在自由钟上刻着一节经文，说在遍地给一切的居民宣告自由。
In Philadelphia, there is a large bell called the Liberty Bell, in which is engraved the scripture, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof," from the Bible.
就是这句话激励着一代又一代的人为了自由前赴后继。
So this Leviticus 25:10, a phrase that has inspired generation of people to go forward and fight for freedom.
自由钟在美国每一个关键的时刻敲响。
So the Liberty Bell has rang at every juncture in Americans' fight for freedom.
所以我请求大家，不沉默，不再沉默，敲响这自由的钟情。
I ask you to ring the bell of freedom and pray for the early realization of religious freedom in China without being silent and also speaking up. Amen.
谢谢。
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's okay. Dr. Reed, anything to add, or if not, I'll go to Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, and I appreciate the work of the Select Committee. During my tenure on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, during which I served as chair, we repeatedly recommended China to be recognized as a country of particular concern for their systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. And I would say they do not like to be called out. In 2021, as we were finalizing our 2020 report, at USERF we experienced a cyber attack, and all signs pointed to the CCP. Now, it should be noted that China's repressive actions do not discriminate. All religious groups are seen as a threat to the Chinese regime, whether it be Christians who are monitored through artificial intelligence and then dinged on their social credit scores, restricting their movements throughout the country, or the Falun Gong, who have been subjected to unbelievable, brutal treatment. In similar fashion, we've heard a lot about the Uyghur Muslims who have been brutally suppressed, placed in what can only only be described as concentration camps and have been used to fuel the CCP billion-dollar organ harvesting industry. Others here today can provide first-hand accounts of what's happening in China. I cannot tell you what's happening behind the Great Wall of China's deception, as I have been sanctioned by China and I'm unable to travel to the country. What I would like to briefly touch on is what can be done. In September of 2000, the U.S. Senate voted to give China permanent most favored nation status, which paved the way for China to join the World Trade Organization. Americans were told that economic activity, trade, would be the key to changing China's poor human rights record. Well, 23 years later, the record shows it's been the key to changing the values of America's businesses, not China. Why else would corporations like Nike, Coca-Cola, Apple, and many others quietly benefit from China's forced labor, and in some cases actually lobby against the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act? You know, China is actually more repressive today than they were 2 decades ago, and the reason is simple. They can afford to be, as American consumers fund their repression, and U.S. corporations, many of whom preach social justice messages here at home, are profiting from the enslavement of religious prisoners. China is not an economic competitor to America. They pose an existential threat to freedom for all people. We should not be bowing to this repressive regime. We should be sternly and diligently watching them for the threat that they are. Permanent most favored nation status should be revoked, and any favored status should be determined annually based upon their human rights record. Finally, U.S. consumers have a role to play in this as well. Despite the pressures created by bad economic policy and inflation, Americans must refuse to buy Chinese products, many of them made by the hands of the enslaved, whose hopes are toward America as their hearts yearn for freedom. We all have a role to play in standing up for religious freedom in China, which literally touches the world. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Rabbi Cooper.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USERF, I would like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and the Select Committee on the CCP for convening this important roundtable. And to the victims of the Chinese government's religious persecution who have graciously joined us here today, thank you for your courage in standing firm against the CCP's encroachment on your religious freedom. We, all of us here, stand in solidarity with you. My name is Abraham Cooper. I'm the current chair of USERF, and USERF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal agency that monitors religious freedom abroad and makes policy recommendations to the President of the United States and Secretary of State in the U.S. Congress. Religious freedom conditions in China remain among the very worst in the world, and in the past decade, the situation has deteriorated significantly under the iron fist rule of the Chinese Communist Party leader, Xi Jinping. That is why USERF has consistently recommended that the State Department designate China as a country of particular concern, or CPC, for the past 23 years. Chinese authorities have intensified the enforcement of its infamous sanitization of religion policy in the last few years, persecuting and causing significant suffering among believers of virtually all religious groups in China, including Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims, Lee Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, underground Catholics, house church Protestants, and Falun Gong practitioners. As the Select Committee is keenly aware, the Chinese government's long-arm persecution has extended overseas, including here in the U.S., targeting members of religious communities with ties in China. Such practice is not only unacceptable, it's also illegal. USERF urges the U.S. government to continue taking relevant measures to hold the Chinese government accountable for all these abuses, including the imposition of sanctions to target Chinese officials and entities responsible for severe religious freedom violations. Just before I end, we're talking about a roundtable here to give solidarity to you, Mr. Chairman, of the New York Select Committee, but I also think this is a call to action to all of the religious groups represented here in the United States. It's time to awaken the sleeping giant of all of the houses of worship and the millions of people who come on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to pray in the appropriate way. There's a disconnect between everything being said here today, all of your efforts, and I first and foremost point to my own, but I think we can all agree that if we can awaken the churches, synagogues, mosques across the United States to look at the suggestions of your committee, we're going to get some significant results. Until that time, I'm afraid we'll be having annual meetings to say how bad things are. So we're not only asking you to do more in Congress, I think we have to look in the mirror and also ask more religious leaders. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, and thank you and your staff for having us today for this conversation, important conversation. I am Fred Davey, and I'm the Vice Chair of USERV. As Chair Cooper has said and mentioned, the Chinese government's Sinicization policy has generated adverse impact on a whole host of religious groups. We stand in solidarity with the victims of these communities represented here today. My remarks will focus very briefly on the Catholic and Protestant Christians in China, as well as the Falun Gong. The Chinese government has escalated, as we've all said, its persecution of Protestant Christians since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. And shockingly, this trend appears to only have intensified over the last year as the government carried out a nationwide crackdown on Protestant house churches by harassing, detaining, physically abusing, and sentencing house church Protestants who refused to join the state-controlled Protestant church. The government has also continued in its prosecution of underground Catholics who remain loyal to the Vatican. Unfortunately, the Vatican-China agreement on bishop appointments has not brought improvement in religious freedom to these vulnerable Catholics. In fact, just this past year, authorities detained and then forcibly disappeared a number of underground Catholic bishops and other priests who refused to join the state-controlled Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association. Falun Gong remains one of the most persecuted religious groups in China, as the government routinely harasses, detains, and imprisons practitioners for their faith, often accusing them of belonging to a cult under Article 300 of China's criminal law. The Chinese government also relentlessly pursues and intimidates religious refugees and asylum seekers as they have escaped China, as we've heard. The targets of such CPC harassment include members of the Shinxin Holy Reformed Church, also members of, also known as the Mayflower Church, when they are seeking refugee status in South Korea, Thailand, as well as the Falun Gong practitioners here in the United States. Let me say a personal word before I wrap up, and that is I had the opportunity to visit China in 2012. I went to Tibet, so I'm really interested in hearing from my colleague here. I personally experienced surveillance, control of my electronic devices when I landed in Tibet. I got a notice on my phone that said, you are here as a representative of as a guest of the Chinese government. You're expected to comport yourself accordingly. I didn't even know, they knew I was in the country. I should have known that. But even more sadly, while there, a number of the Buddhists pulled us apart and aside and said, you should understand that much of what you see here is not authentic. But we're doing this under duress. And then really tragically, two Tibetan Buddhist priests self-immolated while we were there. And the government shut down the TV communication, our phone communication, and for 18 hours we were cut off from the outside. So I know a little personally about the reach of the Communist Party's oppressive activities, particularly in Tibet, and with others around the country. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleague, and I thank you for your work and the work of the committee. And you, sir, as our chair has said, and as our former chair said, looks forward to continuing work with this committee.
Thank you, sir. Sir.
Chairman Gallagher and members of the committee, my name is Bhuchung Tsering. I'm from the International Campaign for Tibet, but also I'm a practicing Buddhist. And today I want to dwell a bit on Chinese government's attitudes, policy towards Tibetan Buddhism and the future of Tibetan Buddhism as we see it. And I think Perkins mentioned about the existential threat that the religions are facing in China. It's particularly so for Tibetan Buddhism because there are certain essential elements of Tibetan Buddhism for Tibetan Buddhism to survive as it is. And today, the Chinese government is altering that framework where the Dalai Lama is an essential part of that Buddhism. And therefore, we would urge that the Select Committee in particular, but Congress in general, look at this as you approach your policy towards China. Since Chinese occupation in 1959, Tibet has undergone several changes on its religious frontier. First of all, in the initial years, the Chinese government tried to physically destroy Tibetan Buddhism, be it destruction of monasteries, disrobing of religious leaders, or making the communities subservient to the Communist Party. Thereafter, in the 80s and the 90s, the Chinese government realized that that policy was no longer working. The Tibetan faith in their own religion continues to be there. They were resilient despite all the persecution, and therefore the Chinese government changed its policy, and today now it's a policy of control. The Chinese Communist Party, which doesn't believe in religion, wants to control Tibetan Buddhism and the essential element of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the theory of reincarnation, where spiritually you're supposed to believe in the system to be able to have control over it. And in 1995, the Chinese authorities first of all interfered to the succession of one of the senior Tibetan Buddhist leader called the Pan Yongguang. When he passed away, his reincarnation was recognized by the Dalai Lama, as rightly he should do. But the Chinese government imprisoned that child, who is no longer a child now, and we haven't heard about him since then. Instead, the Chinese authorities appointed their own candidate, who now is being groomed to serve the Chinese political agenda. So therefore, I would have 4-point recommendations to the Select Committee and to the Congress. First, the Select Committee should strongly assert that it's the Dalai Lama and the legitimate Tibetan leadership in exile that should have the right to decide on the future of the Tibetan people and the Tibetan destiny. In particular, on the issue of Tibetan religion, this committee and the Congress should continue to and be forcefully asserting the fact that it's only the present 14th Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists who should have the right to decide on all matters of Tibetan religion, particularly so on the future of the Dalai Lama, because that's what the Chinese government wants to use for in future to control Tibet. Therefore, in 2011, the Dalai Lama came out with a statement about his reincarnation, saying that when he reaches the age of 90, which is 2 years from now, he will outline his the process of his reincarnation. I urge this committee and Congress to endorse the Dalai Lama's 2011 statement to say that only he has the right to decide on his future. Finally, on the broader issue of Tibet, Congress has done much to legislate its position, and there is currently a pending legislation in both houses of Congress called Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Conflict Act. In House, it's 533, introduced by Representative McCall and Representative Jim McGovern. I urge the Select Committee to endorse that act so that it can assure the Tibetan people that there is continued US support come what may. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Curry.
Thank you very much, Chairman Gallagher, members of the committee. David Curry, CEO of Global Christian Relief, also honored to be part of USERF. And our organization has been working to support Christians for many decades in China and speak out on their behalf. Recently, a pastor of a house church in Beijing said this: "I've been a pastor for 20 years, and only now have I been asked to boost the thought of President Xi more than King Jesus. I won't do it, but I can sabotage the CCTV camera recording my sermon for only so long. They will come for me soon, no matter what. That will make my words reverberate more." And that really paints a picture of what is happening in China today, certainly in the Christian church with Uyghur Muslims and others. There is a sophisticated surveillance system which is giving access to the Chinese government to individual religious practice and scoring that practice as a negative on their citizenship score, which means the deeper you are in your faith, the more you want to attend a synagogue, a mosque, a church, you will be considered as an enemy of China. There are many things which we can do, some of which have been mentioned by my colleagues at USERF. One thing we would suggest is greater assistance on countering Chinese censorship, this technical Great Wall that's up around this country and people trying to practice their faith. Help from the U.S. Agency for Global Media, for NGOs such as are represented here to communicate, to build a bridge between faith communities, because it won't be too long before they are so isolated and in their isolation discouraged, and I don't think we'll be able to practice their faith fully. So that's one recommendation we would say, and we'll submit others as well. So thank you, Chairman Gallagher.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Barr, any comments?
Well, I have no questions. I just want to thank the guests here for sharing the persecution of religious people of faith in China. This has been going on for a long time. The irony of the Chinese Communist Party referring to liberation in 1949 and beyond, when it was a systematic suppression of the free expression of faith throughout the history of the Chinese Communist Party. It continues today, and that's why the Select Committee needs to remain focused on it. Thank you, Chairman.
Pastor Roberts.
Chairman Gallagher, thank you so much for this meeting, the invitation to be here. Instead of explaining what we do, let me just speak to about 4 things I would encourage the committee to consider. Because the reality is, we've got to talk about China. And so thank you for doing this. We've also got to realize that we don't want a war with China, and it's complex. It's economics, it's technology, and religion is caught up in the middle. That makes it even harder. But we have to deal with it. So here are 4 things I would say about it. Number 1, we have to look at it in terms of the long haul. Some people are asking, and I really appreciated your comments, Mr. Perkins. Some people think that this has just gradually happened over the last 2 decades. I would submit in a long haul kind of mindset like the Chinese have, seeing things in terms of decades and hundreds of years. What you're seeing is the response of Tiananmen Square, slowly building log after log to build a structure to where it is now that pushes back on the human rights of those people in China, especially those that are people of faith. And so whatever strategy you have, it must be long haul. If it's not, it'll just be a brief period to talk about what's going on that's tough right now and how to push that forward. Second thing I would say is we need multiple approaches. I'm grateful for Bob Fu. What you do, sir, you're to be commended. And Pastor Pan, I found out, is literally living where I grew up hunting and fishing. And I'm a good Baptist pastor. I'll take you out and teach you how to do that if you want, any weekend that you want. And it's a lot of fun. So anyhow, but I would say we've got to have the Bob Fus of the world that are calling people out, but we also need other approaches that are quiet. Please keep in mind, not all Chinese are happy about this. They're forced to live in that context. What are our relationships with those people? I understand as congressman, you can't do that, but I can. I'm a citizen. I can build relationships with individual people. And so I want Bob Fu doing what he does, but there are other Chinese that are there that are quietly doing things. We need to support them. We need to encourage them, because over time they will push back. And a third thing I would say is, and once again, Mr. Perkins, I loved what you said. I think the reason that made us slow pushing back on China was all about money. And I know this is about China. Please don't forget India. Know that Christians are massively being persecuted there. Muslims are massively being persecuted in India. It's about money. It's about money. We will live to regret this in time. And so I would say we have to think about all of them. The fourth thing I would say is we need to focus on how do we bring the clerics together. Majid and I have an organization together. He's not here representing that organization. We were in Pakistan this year bringing people together. They're now doing the retreats together where for 3 days, pastor and imams come together, throw away the key. And we had an imam where the Christians are persecuted, literally, who's a wealthy imam tied to the government in a major city there. Just had the church built next door to his house. He said, no one will burn your church down now. That's because the clerics are working together. They know one another. We were just in Sudan before everything blew up. And the pastors and imams that we're working with are literally texting us on WhatsApp. They're fleeing to 2 particular cities, and we're working with them, trying to get them aid and other things that are involved. You cannot underestimate what clerics on the ground can do, especially when they get outside their own tribe. All kind of good stuff happens. The fifth, and I would just throw this in, there are surrounding nations that can help us. I think it concerns me, Majid and I both work in the Middle East. I wish the Middle East nations were more vocal on what's going on with the Uyghurs. I've told them this. Yeah. In my meetings with them, it frustrates me. They need to speak out because that's their faith. So what the Uyghurs are doing and how they're facing persecution, I know Vietnam has its problems. I know you, sir, have your problems in Vietnam, but I'm telling you, that country has come a long way. They've passed laws. I'll be there in about a week, meeting with them. It's been a long-haul approach. Countries that are around China, that are surrounding them, could make a big difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Imam Majid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this meeting. My name is Muhammad Majid, I'm Commissioner of USRF. Today I would like to briefly concentrate to discuss the Chinese government persecution of ethno-religious minority groups, including the Uyghurs. I heard from them directly in many town hall meetings, and other Muslim minorities and the Tibetan Buddhist. Since 2017, Chinese government has detained millions of Uyghurs and Muslims and others minority groups, and they engage in what they call brainwashing, this massive brainwashing and concentration camp. And they also, the people who have left those camps have talked about the indoctrination and how the government tried to have them to change their belief system. About 900,000 Muslims children have been separated from their parents. Also, that the government did not leave the Chinese Muslims and the Uyghurs and so forth who live in the country alone. When they go abroad, they go to those governments and ask them to return them back to China, to torture them and to detain them. Also, that we have seen that the government have forced Muslims to eat pork and to do things that again is their religion, and we would like to also to stand with our brothers, the Tibetan Buddhist, who have been punished because of just getting the picture of the Dalai Lama in China. And therefore, USRF stands in solidarity with all those victims of the Chinese government persecuting those people. I myself, I've heard directly from the members of Uyghur communities. We have town hall meetings of hearing from Muslims directly those being persecuted, of the terror and the separations and the killing and having people living with them in their home. They send somebody to live with the Muslims in their home to see how they behave. Imagine somebody living in your home, representing the government in your own house. And those are the things that we heard directly from the leaders. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. From the 8th District of Wisconsin. Father, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome, Chairman Gallagher and members of the committee, and I thank all of those present for your presence today. It's a good thing that we hear about the state of religious freedom, or perhaps I should say lack of religious freedom in China. My name is Father Kurt Klisman. I'm a member of the Order of the Most Holy Trinity and of the Captives, a Roman Catholic religious order of priests and brothers founded in the year 1198. We are also known as Trinitarians. We were founded with the express purpose of liberating Christians who are being held captive because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And through the centuries, our priests and brothers have ransomed thousands of men and women and returned them to their families and to their communities. We've also played a role in American history. Right behind me, there's a painting of Thomas Jefferson, and we worked with Thomas Jefferson when he was a minister to France to try to liberate American sailors who'd been held captive by Barbary pirates. We also had a role in the abolition movement here. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a very famous poem, The Mantle of St. John de Matha, the legend of the red, white, and blue. And it was an important piece of American culture that linked the work of liberation conducted by our order to the ongoing fight for the abolition of slavery in the United States. But the need for our work of liberation and of our efforts to encourage religious freedom continues to exist in the world. I serve as the president of Trinitarian International Solidarity in the United States. We have chapters around the world, and our organization directs our order's ongoing work with and on behalf of persecuted Christians. We seek to create awareness of religious persecution, encourage prayer for those who are persecuted, and engage in concrete assistance to those who are or have experienced religious persecution. We have priests and brothers working in places where it is illegal to practice the faith. They risk their lives to be in solidarity with and to serve people who truly suffer religious persecution. We collaborate with other religious communities and organizations to assist persecutions in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. And we're very concerned about the situation of Christians in China. True religious freedom does not exist there. Those who advocate for religious freedom often suffer greatly. Last year, 90-year-old Joseph Cardinal Zen was brought before a Hong Kong court of the CCP on charges of conspiracy to collude with foreign forces. This is related to his ongoing defense of political freedom and of the rights of the Catholic Church in Hong Kong and in China. Bishops, priests, and religious leaders and members of the faithful live in fear of being detained, imprisoned, abused, having their churches destroyed if they dare to speak out. In addition, it's well known that the church buildings are periodically damaged and destroyed in various regions of China by government order. Crosses are removed, building permits are denied, building codes are used to authorize the leveling of church buildings. More recently, the CCP, despite having an agreement with the Catholic Church to collaborate on the appointment of bishops, appointed a bishop without any approval from the Vatican. The CCP seeks to exert control over the internal activities and governance of the Church in China. So I encourage members of this committee to continue to do whatever is possible to shed light on the situation of all religious believers in China. Religious liberty is a right to which all human beings have a claim. I appreciate very much the words of Rabbi Cooper, who also pointed out that members of leaders in religious communities have a significant role in making sure that the situation is known among our own congregations. Thank you all for your time and for the invitation to speak.
Thank you, Father. Pastor Jackson.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, and honorable members of the Select Committee for allowing me to address you today. My name is Corey Jackson. I'm the senior pastor at Trinity Park Church in Cary, North Carolina. Before I planted and pastored this church, I was a missionary in China for 7 years and led various missions initiatives in Southwest China. During that time, I became very connected to a group of unregistered house churches that was just starting then, which has grown substantially over the past 2 decades to now. I've walked alongside this growing affiliation of churches for 21 years and currently serve as a strategic advisor to this group, which is now in over 150 cities in China. To stand up for the oppressed is a deep and distinct value of Christianity. In Psalm 82:3, the Bible says, "Defend the cause of the weak and the fatherless, maintain the rights of the poor and the oppressed." rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And that is why we're here today, that through the important work of government, we stand up for the rights of the oppressed in China. This is not just a competition between countries, but a competition between ideals, with China seeking to advance ideas that allow for strong state control over nearly all aspects of life, including religion. As you'll hear from others today, Xi Jinping is repressing in a more widespread and severe way, not just Christians, but other religious groups as well. This is a matter we should collectively care for and stand up for together. The church I pastor and hundreds of other American churches are supportive of, care about, and pray for the house churches in China and other religious groups facing persecution on a regular basis. The churches I am particularly connected with in China may surprise you. They're largely located in urban areas comprised of educated, upwardly mobile, well-resourced citizens in these 150 cities. Within these churches, one particularly egregious example of religious repression took place on December 9, 2018 against Early Rain Covenant Church and their well-known pastor Wang Yi. Prior to the time of being brutally targeted by the CCP, membership in this church was 800. In mid-December of 2018, news of this persecution against Wang Yi and his wife John Rong and others in their church was trending worldwide, with people in over 140 countries reading a statement Wang Yi wrote before he was imprisoned entitled "My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience." Over 300 Early Rain church members have faced various forms of persecution, 27 serving in criminal detention, some lasting up to 9 months. They were denied due process and legal representation. Members of the church still today are facing various forms of persecution. In fact, Wang Yi's wife and son are still under house arrest today, nearly 5 years later. Members have been and are being beaten, stripped naked at different points. Those in detention were intentionally dehumanized on a daily basis. Children are often arrested with their parents. They are used, those children, as bargaining chips, and will even separate nursing mothers from their babies. The Bible does not mince words when this kind of evil is being perpetrated among those who are made in God's image. Proverbs 14:31 says, "Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors God." The oppression of the image of God and the church of God is an insult to God as their creator and redeemer. And though the case of Early Rain is prominent, it is not an anomaly. We're seeing repression growing across unregistered house churches in nearly every facet of Chinese society. We've seen many forms of this. One Christian we know was charged with an illegal border crossing while having a legal visa. Another was arrested for homeschooling his children and then was sentenced to 2 years in prison because they found, quote, politically sensitive material on his computer. Another prominent pastor we know has 24/7 police presence outside his home since 2019. These are 3 examples of hundreds, maybe thousands. The list goes on and on. This increasing repression is happening everywhere in churches I am familiar with. And if the global community does not speak up and stand for religious freedom, the situation will worsen. I'll close with this. If you're a pastor or a Christian in China, you wonder each and every Sunday whether it will be your turn to face the fires of persecution. And quite remarkably, they are willing to face these fires. They stand up for their rights and use attorneys when they're able to, but they accept these trials as an opportunity to follow the way of Jesus, the way of the cross. So thank you for considering Select Committee of China, how the United States Congress can continue to take a stand against the CCP's desire to control the religious freedom efforts of its citizens.
Thank you, sir. And finally, before Mr. Jimenez, Imam Hajim.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you to the Select Committee for organizing around on the table important topic. I'm studying Saudi Arabia 6 years. My name is Ankar. I'm not speaking English. Mr. Umar, translation. Amsan ve rahmet. Mən birinci qətim olaraq səlcət edirdim. Mən bugünkü müşüşüğüm otağımdan xoşalım.
I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm very excited. So this is the first time I'm attending such a meeting, so I'm a little bit excited.
Hər qanday bir dövlətdən rəhbərlər olsun, dünyanın hər qanday yerində yaşayotgan və yoki dünyanın hər qanday bir çoğ bir dövlət tutqan bo'lsin, buni aqalli bilish tegishli. Allah ibodat qiladigan masjid, church yoki bo'lmasa ilohiy ibodat o'rniga yoki bo'lmasa qurollarni ular ko'ydamaydi, aqalli bir dövlətdən rəhbərlər olsun. Ammo Xitay bununla qılcı Allah'ın ilahi mescidi olsun, Kur'an olsun, Tevrat olsun, İncil, Zebur olsun, hemmi nersini qırğın qılıyor.
Nowhere in the world, any country, any government is burning Quran or Bible in any part of the world. But it is in China. It is a state policy to burn the Quran, religious books, and sacred books.
Xitaylarniki bularning dunyo meşhur olan ipek bilen bularniki parpur narsalarga üstü keladi. Bular tashqi ko'rinish nihoyatda samimiy ko'ringan bilan amaliki ichki jihatlardan nurg'unlagan bizniki shu ustozlarimizni, imomlarimizni bular to'xtamay turmush ulayotdi, hozirgacha qiryotdi, oila tavobatlarni hech qanday saqlanmadi hozir.
Since 2017, China started a genocidal policy against the Uyghur people. The first target, the victims of the Chinese this repression policy were the imams and the religious leaders of the Uyghur people.
Şahsen ben Saudi Arabistan'da 6 yıl okudum. Okuş jarayonida biz o'zi pasport berib bizni o'qitib, ayolingizda Misrdagi va meni savodoshlarimning hammani muddatsiz tutib etdi. Qamoq jazosi usulda ulardan ayrilib qoldi. Hamma butun dunyoga tarilib ketdi. Hayot qolganlarimiz Amerikaga, Turkiyaga, Saudiyaga ketdi. Qolganlarimiz tarafdan tutib ketdi.
So I studied in Saudi Arabia for 6 years. So I left China legally for studying religion in Saudi Arabia, and my intention was to go back to my country to serve my people. But because of the Chinese policy change policy in our homeland, so all my friends who were studying in other parts of the world as well just couldn't return back, or Chinese, when some of them returned, but they disappeared into the concentration camps.
Bizim şu ruhi kesellerde hazır şuna deb qaralyapti. Ammo lekin men o'qib, haqiqatan 2014-2015 yilda baqa vaqtimda biz bir fakultetda o'qib tushgan vaqtim savodoshlarim bilan ko'z oldimda hozirmi turibdi. Tepsiga 5 yil qalpoq kiygizib, qo'lga qilib bir savodoshim shu aeroplanga tushgan zamonlar bo'lib ketdi. Meni hatto 10 kun so'rab qildi. O'zi o'qitib, o'zi bizni shunda qijnadida.
Actually, Chinese government allow us to go to Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries to study Islam. But when we return, for example, I returned back in 2014 and 15, but they arrested us at the airport and interrogated us, and some of our friends who returned to see their families on their vacation disappeared.
Har qanday bir masjidlardagi imomlar bo'lsin, ustozlarimiz bo'lsin va yoki baloqqa insonlar bo'lsin, bularni ayt samimiy, rostchil, Allohning kitobini o'qiydigan odam yolg'onchilik qilmaydi. Ammo bularni tutib, oila balchaqlari bolalarni tortib, bularni qirib etdi turmadi.
What's happening is unimaginable in terms of religious repression, because Chinese government does only punish the people who teach religion, but all members of their families, their close relatives, are also being persecuted because of this persons, who taught the religion, train the young people. So their relatives, family members, all being persecuted.
Qadisi men kichik vaqtimda dinni o'qiyotgan vaqtimda ustozim yoshda masjidning imomi 2 oy burun xabarni oldim. Ustozim turmada uylab ketibdi. 14 kichikgan bir bolasining muddatsiz qamoq jazosiga hukm qilibdi.
So my teacher, the Imam who taught me when I was in my homeland, he died in concentration camp. And I got this news 2 months ago, and his son, who was 14 years old, sentenced to life in prison.
Har qanday Amerika hukumatiga birinchilab rahmatimni bildiraman, ammo bu qonunlar aylanganida yetarli qo'llanildi.
There are a lot of condemnation around the world and in the world because of the Chinese government repression of the Uyghurs. But also we are grateful for the U.S. Congress to pass through legislation about the Uyghurs, one Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act and other Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. But these legislations and the measures taken by the administration or other governments have not had any direct effect on the people on the ground.
Həmistənin ailesi var, qayıt yalayızlar, baldırınlarda oturalaysızlar, amma məğlubat emas.
I'm very different from all of you. You have your family. You can communicate with your family members, with your loved ones, but I cannot do it. I have not been able to communicate with my parents, with my loved ones back home since 2017.
Ölümden ağzından qutluq müşəgi bir möcüz şəkildə gələn bolsamı, 3 yılgıca rəsmiyyətlərim çıxmay, intervyum çağıram. Dostlarım şunda, olar asylum ofisini alıb qalsa, yeterli ispat yox, dedi, yığılıb getdik, yəni amma yox. Bizlərimiz cəhətlərdə ümid qılmam, həm Uyğurlarımızda hər cəhət qanunda yeterli bir maqullansa, küçədə deyə ümidim var.
So the Chinese government also extended its long arms to other countries as well, where the Uyghur lives. So we are not safe even in the U.S. The Chinese government continues to harass us, threaten us, and even force some Uyghurs to spy for Chinese government. But we I have been living here for many years, but until now, unfortunately, I don't have any paper. I have not been invited even to be interviewed about my asylum case.
Ben bir yerde bir Uyghur imam bulaşıktım bilen her günde telefon tapşırıp alıyorum. Dostlarımız olsun, çoğunluğumuz olsun, ben ölü olayım o. Yaşap bulamadım deyse, onda kılma Allah da biz gülenç oldu deyip keç-keçilep olarga deneyeceklerde roy azrak olsun uzak bir ataklı alayım.
So all Uyghurs who lives out of the country are in under a psychological pressure from the Chinese government because they are unable to communicate with their loved ones, so they are all of them in depression. So I'm, as a Uyghur Imam, I have been receiving calls from many Uyghurs who live in abroad, and they told me that they want to, suicide. It will be good for them to suicide, to kill themselves. But I always tell them that there is Allah, there is God. God will help us. These dark days will pass. Be patient. So the Uyghurs, not only in the country but outside also in this difficult situation.
Bugünküdek şunda dünyanın her qaysı joylarida şunda yaxshi shig'illarda o'tiribdiman. Vatanlik ustozlarim bo'lsin, turmushga ketayotgan qarindoshlarim bo'lsin, biz uchun nima ish qilding desa, mana bugünküdek Amerikaga sizlarni ong taldim deydiganda, Alloh so'rab qaz nima ish qilding desa, mushta bir yig'inda butun odamlar onglatdimi bo'lsa deyalaman. Bugun shunchalik hayotimning eng xushal bir kun deb o'yladim.
I am speaking here, so I'm taking a lot of risks because Chinese government, retaliate and try to silence Uyghurs who live abroad, and they threaten them not to expose what's happening in our homeland. But I'm taking a lot of risks to speak here, but I have to do it because it is my duty, and God is there, so God will help us to survive.
Thank you.
Ya ustalarım sana rahmetimi bildirmem. Amerika hükümetine rahmetimi bildirmem.
I thank you for everyone for listening to me.
Great, thank you. I know we're over time. I could stay for longer, and I know we want to have a discussion. But if anyone has to leave, I won't be offended at the same time. Mr. Jimenez, the floor is yours for a question, a comment, whatever you'd like.
Comments
there, but for the grace of God, go us. And so I joined this committee. I had certain thoughts about the Chinese Communist Party. I certainly was not friendly to them and all that, but the more and more I find out what they do, the more and more I believe in the importance of this committee that we serve on. The reason the people of faith are persecuted is pretty simple. People of faith believe in a higher cause, a higher calling, a higher purpose. And that's a direct threat to those that just want you to believe in the state. And so all religions are a threat to the state. All religions are a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. What I find now educational is that not only are they trying to destroy the religion from the outside, but they're trying to destroy it from the inside too. And so you see the same thing. They're trying to install their own Dalai Lama in Tibet, and then they're trying to install their own bishops, Catholic bishops in China. And before you know it, as their influence spreads, and if they actually do attain what their goal is, which is to dominate the world economically, militarily by the year 2050, then we'll see this throughout the world. And we in Congress have to shine the light on what the Chinese Communist Party is really all about, and the threat that it poses not only to the United States, but the threat that it poses to the freedom of the entire world. And so I want to thank you for your testimony. It certainly was educational. It's even worse than I thought, if that's possible, but it is. And we in Congress, the United States, has to stand for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom to live your life the way you deem fit. And so, I want to thank the chairman for putting this together, and thank you. And really, my heart goes out to each and every one of you that's been persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. I want to make sure my children and my grandchildren don't live in a world that's dominated by the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, thank you, Carlos, for your clear voice that you've spoken with since the start of our committee's work. I have a question. I mean, getting to the disconnect that Rabbi Cooper alluded to between what's talked about in a group like this, and obviously all of you wouldn't be here if you didn't understand the issue and the threat and weren't willing to talk about it, taking enormous risks in the process. Why is that same thing not happening in the synagogues, in the churches, in the houses of worship? Is it just a lack of awareness? Is it a fear of retribution? Is there institutional resistance in the Catholic Church, for example? I'd just be curious if people have thoughts on why there is that disconnect, or if you don't believe there is. Yeah, Dr. Fu.
I have a first-hand experience.
Yeah.
Basically, after living in the U.S. for the past 20 plus years, even traveling among the Chinese church and the American churches, I think that shows the reason why, even the Chinese, there are 1,500 over Chinese church in North America. Back to 2000 and year 2000, I think there was an International Day of Prayer focused on China. Among 100,000 churches for the first Sunday of November, dedicated to pray for Chinese persecuted church. You know how many Chinese church in North America sign up to pray? 0. Not a single Chinese church dared to sign up to even to pray for those who are persecuted in China. Mostly is the Chinese Communist Party's intimidation and cause them fear, and even some pastors, like I was invited to a mission conference in Maryland. Already they booked me the ticket just because one deacon of that church found my name was too dangerous for their church. They canceled my keynote speakership in the whole mission conference. Said, "Oh, my family would be arrested for simply hosting you in our church in Maryland." So this is happening all over, including, I think, American churches as well. I think some of friends here can testify. And also the CCP's propaganda, United Front work. They have their spying network inside the churches in America. Basically, if you raise the China religious persecution issue, then they will use their network to threaten you inside the US soil, in the US congregation. So this is self, I think, worth the investigation.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of witnesses.
It's
I
own
think.
form of transnational aggression.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Any personal experiences with it? Or, I don't mean to pick on the Catholics, but that's where I tried. Yeah.
I mean, I think much of it is a lack of information. Nobody is handing each priest or each deacon in the Catholic Church a homily. Lots of it has to do with the lack of information, and partially because it's not in the English language, or it's not in a language that most of our clergy can understand. And so getting information out there is important. Conveying the stories that I've heard today is so important, no matter whether it's a Christian or Muslim, a Buddhist, whatever the person's faith is that they've experienced religious persecution needs to be shared within our congregations. And if we can have more information, hopefully folks will buy into it.
Can I make a comment?
What's that?
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, of course.
I just find that, you know, I'm Catholic myself. And when I go to church on Sunday, somehow the Catholic priests, they run away from they run away from stuff like this. By taking a political stance, all right, pro or against or whatever. They don't talk about it. There's a couple of things you do talk about, right? They talk about pro-life, right? That's because of the church doctrine. But as far as politics and human rights, and I don't see that in the Catholic Church. And I'm a Catholic. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. It could very well be. I mean, part of it is many have heard about the Johnson Amendment. You know, if you speak about politics from the pulpit, you can lose your tax exempt status. So there's an overreach of that. People don't understand what it really means, and sometimes they don't address real human issues.
I think one of the issues here is that having members of the faith community of Chinese Americans visit churches, synagogue, and mosque. People connect faces with causes. When they see us members, sometimes they don't keep. My community have hosted the Uyghurs, and when they heard the stories from them, and they saw the pictures, and they saw what happened, they become more aware of what's happening there. But I think one of the things is just the having members of the community to come to speak in place of worship, and there's awareness about that.
Yeah, we have that. I mean, the problem exists in Congress or politics. I mean, we have presidential candidates, for example, that don't know who the Uyghurs are. Not anybody.
They need to meet one of them.
Yeah. So awareness is
part
key.
of their mission to meet some of those people.
Yeah. Sure.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to step out of my role as usurp for just a minute and step into a role as a trustee of a small Christian college in the South, my alma mater, which is Greensboro College. Our college has a relationship with a university in China that, and the president's not going to like me saying this, but I've told him that I was going to talk about it, so here goes. That gets financial support from that university. I think the distance between that university and the Chinese Communist Party is probably not that great. The point is, it's not the only small liberal arts college in America that has that kind of relationship.
Yeah.
And I think when that exists, there's the opportunity to have a more subtle and perhaps insidious approach to the ways in which people then become immune to the atrocities that we've talked about today. I understand that there's a serious struggle on the part of small, particularly independent, religious-based liberal arts institutions. But another area where we can get really serious about the Chinese influence in America is in that realm. We at least need to know what's going on. Now, to step back in my role so that the executive director back there doesn't yank my chain. I do think it's really important that the Select Committee also consider supporting a UN commission to do a special hearing on the abuses in China, to continue to support targeted sanctions against Chinese officials, and to always, in these bilateral conversations with China, to have religious persecution at the top of the agenda. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Bir sualim qolganki, shu nurg'ulg'an musulmon davlatlarda bizning irqiy qirg'inchiligimiz va yoki nurg'ulg'an kitoblarimiz, qurollarimiz har jihatlarda nurg'ulg'an narsalarimiz kuydirilib, insoniy kimligimiz yo'qolayotgan vaqtlarda musulmon davlatlarning bizga beklar ko'zni yumg'aldi, qarab turyotidi. Hukumat organlari bo'lsa buni tashviqot qilishdan ma'lum jihatlarda bizni siqib cheklab qo'yotidi. Ulardan birlashib yo'l boradi. Bizning mush narsamizdan biri.
Yes, one issue that disappoints us the most is the position of the Muslim majority countries.
Yeah.
The Chinese government destroyed thousands of mosques, and of course also consider even Xi Jinping called the Islam as a mental illness, so to be treated. So this is so, and then all religious books are being burned, so they burn Quran, everything, but still the Muslim majority countries are silent. Of course, the government, we separate the Muslim governments with the people, population don't know really what's happening, because the government, Muslim majority countries, instructed actually the main media to not cover the Uyghur issue. So therefore, the Muslim populations are not aware really what's happening in China, in our homeland, against the Muslim Uyghurs.
Yeah.
So we would like also the U.S. government to ask other Muslim governments to leave this ban on covering the Uyghur issue.
If I could add, there's been a lot of ideas, proposals discussed around the table today. Among them, if you were all given a magic wand, and I'm realizing as I'm saying this that that's a bit of heresy, and put aside political reality for a second, but one thing you can compel the United States Congress or the federal government more broadly to do, what would that thing be? That's a difficult question.
It's not a difficult question. Having worked in the area of religious freedom for 30 years and seeing things happen, generally the real stuff happens behind the scenes in relationship building. And there are credible groups that do credible work quietly behind the scenes that get stuff done. And I would just say everything from giving them access to be able to go into those countries and do things quietly without getting in trouble. Very important, very important. Because when I go to different places, I have to think about, I'm just going to be blunt with you, how's the FBI going to see me going into this country?
Yeah.
There's a lot of laws that you have to be very careful about. That's a huge issue. And I also think you cannot underestimate the power of building relationships with opposites. People that you would never think would get in the room together, but they will. And if you give them time together to talk together, and that takes people with access to those kinds of people who can keep quiet, but they have the resources to do that work. It's a big deal and it makes a big difference. when there's a lot of people that do that. I'm not going to say a lot. There's enough people that do that in different categories that it would help tremendously.
Any other magic wands?
I would say that if and I think he'll be okay for me speaking for him and his
You gotta take off this hat.
I'm going to speak, if Congressman Wolf were here, he would put a spotlight on the lobbying that's being done legitimately here in the U.S. on behalf of China.
Yes.
And being done by former members of this august institution.
Yes.
And so there's legislation, I think, that's extant to address that, and we would encourage the magic wand to be waved over that.
Great point. I need this magic wand the more I understand. Yeah. Spurt.
All of these kind of connect to the economic issues.
Yeah.
And India is one that I think is right around the corner when we talk about religious persecution. And so I think in our, and I say our, the United States Congress, the United States, we need to elevate human rights, religious freedom at the tip of that spear in conversations about economics. Every administration pretty much has pushed human rights, religious freedom to the back seat, thinking economic relationships would change these countries. Again, history has shown us that it's changed us, not them. And so the Congress needs to make human rights, religious freedom being a driver of human rights, a #1 priority, economic issues aside.
Good point. And we have an example in the late Cold War and the Reagan administration's ability to put human rights at the center of its grand strategy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, while still competing in other domains and attempting to cooperate in others with non-proliferation agreements and whatnot. So I completely take your point.
I have a quick
magic wand.
Magic wand.
Yeah.
It's more soft than other approaches, but I think it's effective because the reason the Communist Party installed this Great Firewall and now the surveillance is they don't want to have the Chinese people to know the truth. Most of the Chinese actually, even those inside China, the Tibetan Uyghur region, they even, not aware of the full picture of the atrocities of the Communist Party. So my recommendation is for these kind of hearings, maybe even smaller scale, to move out of the Capitol Hill, go to different areas in different cities, and really not only to wake up the American people, as the father said, many congregations are not fully aware, but also really to broadcast live streaming. Yeah. Many people really, break the internet firewall and broadcast back to the Chinese community. And once, the truth will set them free. Really, many, I think, once the Chinese are also aware, and they will group together, really have the power to resist.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you perhaps a bizarre question. If we were able to bridge the gap that the rabbi talked about, and my priest at St. Matt's every Sunday, your priest, the Pope himself, we're talking about this issue, leaders in your faith were talking about this issue directly to your congregations, your flock. Do you think it would resonate with the people? Do you think, because at the end of the day, if you sort of believe the Whittaker Chambers theory of communism, we're talking about the oldest sin in the history of the world, right? We're talking about a promise that goes back to the Garden of Eden, which is the promise that ye shall be as gods. What the Communist Project envisioned is a world without God that raises men up as gods. Do you think there's a message there that would resonate with the people?
Absolutely. Yes. When the message is given, I can speak from experience, when the message is given, people are thirsty to hear what's happening in different parts of the world in regard to people of faith. And they recognize the gift that we have here. But it's easy to assume everyone has that gift of religious liberty in other parts of the world. When they hear they don't, they want to act. They want to do something. They want to know what to do. And at the same time, the U.S. government, the U.S. people are being held hostage by the fact where our medicine's coming from.
Yes.
Okay? So if we put too much pressure on China, does that mean grandma can't get her blood pressure medicine? Perhaps. Etc. Things like that make a difference. So need to work hand in hand to make sure that we're able to express what we need to express and not feel that we're being held hostage.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll
Sir.
speak on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a pastor, so the church I pastor has about 25 different ethnic groups in the church, so we're a multicultural church. So for one thing, we need to recognize that America is multicultural, we know that, but we're also talking to people who have stories that connect back to China and other nations. So there's an opportunity there to connect with people back to their stories. But to what Mr. Jimenez said, which I thought was a very good point, in the church, we tend to often disconnect our theology from our practice. And what we're really talking about here is, I think if you want to grab people's hearts, you have to teach from your book of faith and then connect it to the real world. And a lot of pastors aren't doing that. But I think if more faith communities were teaching the scriptures or teaching from their book, and then how does this impact the real world? Another problem we have is all we talk about is something going on in the world. We never relate it back to our theology. And so people are like, what do I do with that? But if you can marry the two, which is really important, which what pastors should do, and I find it very much resonates with our people and our church and many churches. But I think pastors and religious leaders need to do a better job of both teaching theology and practice.
Yeah, of course.
Look, to me, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing runs counter to the tenets of all of our religions. So you can marry that together. Pretty seamlessly, actually, all right? Human rights and religious freedom. I mean, being the champion of the oppressed. I think that's the tenet of all of our religions.
Right.
So that's something, and that's something that I when I sit there in church. Obviously, I'm a member of Congress. When I sit there in church, and you talk about what Christ did 2,000 years ago, yeah, but how does that relate to today? All right. And Christ, serving the. I'm sorry, I'm Christian, so I want to talk about Christ. Okay? So, Christ, serving the poor and not being, he was a special individual, right? So, how does that relate to today? I don't get enough of that. All right, I don't get enough of that, and so I think we should, and I think it's time. Look, if we don't, then we may find ourselves in a godless world. Because it's time, we need to start fighting that.
I'll make one more comment real quick that Father Klisman said, which I thought was very important, is we need to be reading theology and sermons from global theologians. And so whatever's being translated out there for us, we're talking about China right now, there's some good work being done translating Chinese theological work of pastors, rabbis, and others. And so we need to just be bringing that out. And so don't just read from your own personal group, read from other people, and it will also help you understand what's going on.
I know I've kept you all 35 minutes longer than you intended. I hope I didn't ruin anybody's lunch plans. My staff is freaking out. Maybe, you know what? My New Year's resolution was to sort of try and listen to the Holy Spirit a little bit more. And right now, the Holy Spirit's telling me we should end in a prayer, which will admittedly be biased towards the Christian perspective, but I think the message will transcend all. So if you join me in a moment of prayer, if you would. God, in today's gospel, we hear the story of how Jesus gathered together his 12 disciples, and he imbued them with the power of the Holy Spirit and gave them the power to go forth and drive out unclean spirits from other people. Now, we obviously don't have that power ourselves, but you have given each and every one of us gifts, and we ask that you help us. You give us the courage to use our gifts, however meager they may seem in comparison with those of the 12 apostles, in order to do good in this world. Use our gifts in order to stand up to evil in this world. Because there is evil in this world. It is seeking to attack us, to divide us, and we ask that you be with us as we struggle on behalf of what is good and what is righteous. And we thank you so much for bringing together this incredible group of leaders. Thank you for their passion. Thank you for their expertise. And I couldn't think of a better group of people to do good works in order to glorify you. Amen. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman.